My name is Kate Nicholls. Today I'll be presenting our work titled Dirty Blood, Attitudes and Emotions in the Context of Blood Donated by Men Who Have Sex with Men. Historically, men who have sex with men have been restricted from donating blood, largely due to concerns around the transmission of HIV. However, improvements in HIV testing and decreases in the prevalence of HIV in the Western world means that policies restricting blood donation from men who have sex with men, or MSM donors, are being eased. In Australia and the US, the time deferral from an MSM donor's most recent sexual encounter has been reduced from 12 to 3 months, while the UK conducts individual risk assessments for all potential donors. Easing these restrictions provides a valuable opportunity to safely increase the available blood supply from volunteer donors. However, it is important to understand how these changes might impact trust in blood collection agencies and perceptions of the safety of the blood donation process. To our knowledge, only one previous study has been conducted in this area. Research by Gabriel and Louis in 2021 indicated that participants were less willing to receive a blood transfusion from an LGBT donor than a heterosexual donor. The research that I will describe today was conducted to delve into this topic further. We were interested in attitudes towards receiving a blood transfusion from an MSM donor specifically, rather than broadly identifying an LGBT donor. We compared these attitudes to those expressed towards receiving a blood transfusion from an MSW donor, or a man who has sex with women. We also aimed to extend on this previous research and incorporate the study of emotions into this area. There is a substantial amount of support for the notion that emotional experiences are critical in the formation of attitudes. Attitudes that are based on emotions are typically more readily accessible in our minds and are less likely to change over time. In the blood donation context specifically, participants' self-reported emotions have been shown to reliably predict their attitudes towards blood donation. When looking at attitudes towards receiving a blood transfusion from an MSM donor, relative to an MSW donor, we decided to examine the possible role of 3 emotions: anxiety, disgust, and gratitude. So, why these emotions? Anxiety refers to the experience of worry, nervousness, and tension, and is often experienced when people perceive that something in their environment is dangerous. Despite the advancements in the safety of the blood donation process, and the extensive testing that is carried out on donated blood samples, the general population still perceives receiving a blood transfusion as moderately risky. Concerns relating to the transmission of HIV appear to drive a large portion of this risk perception, leading us to believe that anxiety might be particularly relevant in the context of receiving a blood transfusion from an MSM donor. The emotion of disgust reflects feelings of repulsion. Many argue that this emotion evolved to drive behaviours that motivated our survival, including the avoidance of pathogens, mate selection, and moral decision-making. Unfortunately, homosexual behaviour can elicit moral disgust among heterosexual participants, often motivated by a view that homosexual behaviour is abnormal. The disgust response towards MSM specifically is thought to be due to a perception of these individuals as vectors of disease, particularly HIV. These concerns highlight the clear potential for the importance of disgust in the current context. Finally, gratitude describes the emotional experience of noticing and appreciating positive aspects of one's environment. This emotion is commonly felt by those who benefit from the altruistic acts of others, with a good example being blood transfusion recipients feeling grateful towards the wider pool of blood donors. However, it is unclear whether the same level of gratitude would be felt towards an MSM blood donor. It is possible that an MSM donor might be viewed by participants as an out-group member, with intergroup bias resulting in a lesser feeling of gratitude. To examine these questions, we conducted 2 studies, both of which were pre-registered. The first study aimed to establish the presence of what we term the donor sexuality effect, meaning we wanted to see whether participants would hold more negative attitudes towards receiving a blood transfusion from an MSM donor relative to an MSW donor. We were also interested in participants' emotional experience of anxiety, disgust, and gratitude when considering each of these possible donors. Finally, we wanted to examine whether the hypothesized relationship between donor sexuality and negative attitudes could be explained by participants' emotional reactions. We recruited 510 participants through an online sampling platform. Participants were eligible to take part in the study if they self-identified as heterosexual and lived in Australia, the UK, or the US. These 3 countries were selected because restrictions surrounding blood donation from MSM have recently changed, so attitudes of the general population towards this group of blood donors are particularly relevant. In the study, participants were asked to imagine a situation in which they required a blood transfusion for medical reasons. They were then presented with brief information about a possible donor before answering some questions about their feelings towards that donor. There were 4 possible blood donors presented in a counterbalanced order: a heterosexual male in his 30s, a homosexual male in his 30s, a heterosexual female in her 20s, and a heterosexual female in her 60s. In this study, we used the labels homosexual and heterosexual to represent the MSM and MSW donors respectively, but we acknowledge that the homosexual label does not capture all men who have sex with men. The 2 female donors were included as distractors and will not be discussed in the results. For each possible donor, participants were asked to indicate how willing, comfortable, and open they felt to receive a blood transfusion from this individual. These items were used to generate a score for negative attitudes towards the donor. Participants also responded to a series of emotion items. To assess the anxiety response, participants indicated how worried, nervous, and anxious they felt, and how much dread they experienced. For disgust, participants indicated their experience of feeling grossed out, nauseous, disgusted, sickened, and repulsed. Finally, gratitude was assessed using the items grateful, thankful, and appreciative. Using 2-tailed paired t-tests, we found that participants held significantly more negative attitudes towards receiving a blood transfusion from the MSM donor than the MSW donor. They also reported stronger experiences of anxiety and disgust and less gratitude. To examine the indirect effects of donor sexuality on negative attitudes by the 3 emotions, we ran a mediation model. Specifically, we were interested in whether the effect of the donor's sexuality on negative attitudes could be explained by participants' emotional reactions of anxiety, disgust, and gratitude. We found that the direct path from donor sexuality to negative attitudes was significant. We also found that the indirect paths via each of the 3 emotions were significant. So, to the extent that receiving a blood transfusion from an MSM donor elicited greater feelings of anxiety, stronger negative attitudes were detected. To the extent that receiving a blood transfusion from an MSM donor elicited greater feelings of disgust, stronger negative attitudes were detected. And finally, to the extent that considering a blood transfusion from an MSM donor elicited less gratitude, stronger negative attitudes were detected. Interestingly, the indirect path via anxiety was stronger than that through disgust and gratitude. From this first study, we can establish that heterosexual participants report more negative attitudes towards receiving a blood transfusion from an MSM donor relative to an MSW donor. We know that they also experience more negative and less positive emotion. At this point, we were interested in whether there was anything we could do to change this. Given the strength of the anxiety response that we detected, we wondered whether this would be an important aspect to address. Given the suspected connection between anxiety in this context and concerns around the potential for HIV transmission, we decided to test the impact of reminding participants that all donated blood undergoes rigorous safety testing and is screened for a variety of infectious diseases, including HIV. Ultimately, in the second study, we aimed to examine whether the negative attitudes and emotions experienced towards MSM donors could be offset by reminding participants of the safety protocols in place throughout the blood donation process. The second study was identical to the one previously described, aside from this manipulation. Prior to being presented with the 4 hypothetical donors, half of the participants were given the following reminder. Most of the blood used for transfusions comes from blood donations given by volunteer blood donors. All blood donations are tested to ensure that the blood supplied to patients is safe. These screening tests look for infectious diseases that can be passed on to patients through a blood transfusion, such as HIV, hepatitis B and C, syphilis, and malaria. The other half of the participants were simply asked to consider a situation where they required a blood transfusion for medical reasons, following the procedure of the first study. 1,065 participants were recruited from the same online sampling platform. Results for participants who did not receive the safety testing reminder replicated the pattern of results for Study 1. When participants considered receiving a blood transfusion from an MSM donor, they reported more negative attitudes, anxiety, and disgust, and less gratitude than when considering receiving the transfusion from an MSW donor. The results for participants who did see the safety testing reminder also followed the same pattern, with more negative attitudes, anxiety, and disgust, and less gratitude reported towards the MSM donor relative to the MSW donor. For the mediation analyses, among participants who did not see the safety testing reminder, the direct effect of the male donor's sexuality on negative attitudes was significant. The indirect path via anxiety was also significant, to the extent that considering a blood transfusion from an MSM donor elicited stronger feelings of anxiety, more negative attitudes were detected. The indirect path via disgust was also significant, to the extent that considering a blood transfusion from an MSM donor elicited stronger feelings of disgust, more negative attitudes were detected. And finally, the indirect path via gratitude was significant, to the extent that considering a blood transfusion from an MSM donor elicited less feelings of gratitude, more negative attitudes were detected. Among participants who did see the safety testing reminder, the direct effect of the male donor's sexuality on negative attitudes was also significant. The indirect path via anxiety was again significant. For this condition, the experience of disgust did not mediate the relationship between male donor sexuality and negative attitudes. However, the indirect path via gratitude was significant. Thus, the mediation results for this condition followed the same pattern, aside from the non-significant finding for disgust. In this condition, the size of the indirect effect via anxiety was significantly larger than those via disgust or gratitude, replicating the pattern found in Study 1. The size of the indirect path through anxiety in this condition was also notably larger than among participants who did not see the safety testing reminder. Taken together, these results tell us that the general population may hold negative attitudes towards receiving blood donated by MSM donors, experiencing more negative and less positive emotions associated with this context. These negative attitudes appear to be robust and are not offset by simply highlighting the rigorous safety protocols followed by blood collection agencies. In fact, given the size of the anxiety reaction and the strength of this pathway in the mediation model for those in the safety testing reminder condition, including this reminder may have had the opposite of the intended effect, drawing participants' attention towards the risk of transmission of infectious disease. While this study represents a specific example, and in practice, blood recipients are not typically aware of this type of information about their donor, the results speak to broader social perceptions about the inclusion of MSM donors in the blood donation pool. While a safety testing reminder appears to be insufficient to shift the prejudicial attitudes towards MSM donors, we hope to establish a solution to this issue. Given the strength of anxiety as a mediator of the relationship between donor sexuality and negative attitudes, a targeted intervention to address anxiety in this context may prove beneficial. We anticipate that these findings may generalize to the donation of other substances, such as stem cells, organs, and breast milk, and possibly to other marginalized societal groups. However, we expect that different emotional experiences may be involved that are context-specific. While anxiety, disgust, and gratitude were the emotions of interest in this case, different emotions may be relevant in other contexts. It is possible that targeting these emotional experiences more directly may be the key to addressing this issue. Thank you. Please feel free to email me if you have any questions or comments about today's talk.